Hi, my name is Fritz Kersting. When the ancient Greeks and Persians used to consult about certain matters, before they began, they would bring out musicians, and the musicians would play pleasing melodies and try to get the public in a certain mood so they could begin the consultation. If the consultation got tense or stressful, they would bring out the musicians again. The musicians would try to calm the situation. So this is one of the purposes of music back in the ancient Greek and Persian times. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of music.
Immerse yourselves in the ocean of my words, that ye may unravel its secrets and discover all the pearls of wisdom that lie hid in its depths.
Okay, the talk is called The Five Spiritual Powers. The purpose of this talk is to share some of my personal experiences in my quest to unravel the secrets and pearls of wisdom in the Baha'i writings. Hopefully, some of you will share your experiences and opinions with me. You may write to me at fritzkersting@gmail.com or go to my website, fritzkersting.com. The title and inspiration of this presentation comes from a tablet by Abdul-Baha called The Five Physical and Spiritual Powers. The five physical powers are our physical senses: sight, hearing, taste, speaking, etc. I will focus on the five spiritual powers. Let's read. It's from the book Baha'i World Faith, page 317. Abdul-Baha says, "Man also has spiritual powers: imagination, which conceives things; thought, which reflects upon realities; comprehension, which comprehends realities; memory, which retains whatever man imagines, thinks, and comprehends. The intermediary between the five outward powers and the inward powers is the sense which they possess in common, that is to say, the sense which acts between the outer and inner powers, conveys to the inward powers whatever the outward powers discern. It is termed the common faculty, because it communicates between the outward and inward powers, and thus is common to the outward and inward powers." After cross-referencing with a passage in the book Some Answered Questions referring to the common faculty, it says, "This intelligence of man is the intermediary between his body and his spirit." When I read this passage for the first time, I was very interested and intrigued to hear that imagination, thought, comprehension, and memory were called spiritual powers. The more I read and reflected on this passage, the more it interested me. It occupied my mind for a long time, so I began asking myself questions. If the Baha'i writings have secrets and pearls of wisdom to be discovered, what was the secret to be revealed here? How do I unravel a secret? How do I discover the pearls of wisdom? These questions were on my mind when one day I happened to read a passage by Baha'u'llah that was talking about the methods of teaching the faith, and it mentioned the word memorize. Let's read this section. It's on page 200 of the tablets of Baha'u'llah. It says, "These sanctified souls should ponder and meditate in their hearts regarding the methods of teaching. From the text of the wondrous heavenly scriptures, they should memorize phrases and passages bearing on various instances, so that in the course of their speech they may recite divine verses whenever the occasion demandeth it, inasmuch as these holy verses are the most potent elixir, the greatest and mightiest talisman." What a powerful passage. How clear is this? We have to memorize and recite phrases and passages from the holy text in order to teach the faith. When I read the word memorize, I instantly thought about Abdul-Baha's tablet on the five spiritual powers. memory being spiritual power number 4. If memory is so important, then I had better start memorizing. Then I remembered reading about these national memory contests and the astounding things they would memorize. They would memorize long lists of numbers and words and other quite amazing feats of memorization. I started asking myself, how do they do that? How can I learn to do that? As I started to investigate how to improve my memory, I discovered that there is a whole science dedicated to memorization called mnemonics. This really excited me. I read everything I could about mnemonics. I applied the techniques, and within a short time I was memorizing at least 5 times faster than before. Whether it was a prayer, a telephone number, or a grocery list, memorization became much easier. Maybe I was unraveling a secret, maybe even a pearl of wisdom. The interesting thing about the science of mnemonics is that the most important ingredient for success in memorization is using your imagination, which we know is the first spiritual power. This really intrigued me. Making images, linking them together, or associating them with other things are all techniques of mnemonics. Making rhymes and changing the words to existing musical melodies will also help you memorize. One example is the alphabet sung to the melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, which we all know. An interesting thing I found is apparently the Greeks thought memory was important. The Muses, the personification of knowledge and the arts, especially literature, dance, and music, are the 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne. This is where the word mnemonics comes from, the wife of Zeus. She was basically memory personified, and there's a list on the screen of the 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne. I'm not going to go into the techniques of mnemonics now, but I recommend reading whatever you can about it. Google it. Just look up whatever you can find about mnemonics. Each book that I read taught basically the same thing as far as techniques go, so don't worry too much about if one book is better than another. So now we know that imagination, the first spiritual power, is the key to memorization. What else do we know about imagination? The definition of imagine is the ability to form images and sensations that are not perceived through sight, hearing, and other senses. Also, you can imagine an idea or a concept. This is pretty clear. Abdul-Baha says that imagination conceives things. But when you define the word conceive, it amplifies the concept of imagination. The dictionary defines to conceive as to form or develop in the mind. Obviously, it also means to become pregnant. Some of the synonyms for conceive are devise, formulate, design, originate, create, develop. There's more listed on the screen. My point is that if you look up the definitions of these words, it kind of amplifies your understanding of the word to conceive. Okay, I think it's time for some music. This is a little music from the writings of the Baha.
Grant that I may soar to the noblest heights. Enable me to draw nigh unto Thee, that I may gain admittance into Thy presence. Take up my abode near Thee, and voice the expressions of praise, bearing witness that Thou art God, that there
A little exercise you can do is to look up some of these synonyms, reflect on how they're related to the word imagination, and really you'll come up with some interesting thoughts. It would be nice to spend some time thinking about this because imagination is so important. It would also be nice to reflect on some of the things you've imagined in your life, or your kids. You see your kids imagining things, drawing things. It's a nice thing to reflect about. You can reflect about the famous men in history and how they imagined a certain invention or a certain policy or movement. We have to understand also that imagination can be used for negative things and for evil. How many times have you heard Baha'u'llah say the phrase idle fancies and vain imaginings? Dozens of times in the writings. He uses this phrase a lot, condemning the actions of the leaders of his time and urging us not to pollute our imaginations with our own ego. This tells me that we have to be very careful how we use our imagination. Imagination is powerful, whether for good or bad. Shoghi Effendi used his imagination a lot to visualize building the world center, forming teaching plans, and establishing the administrative order. Here's an example of Shoghi Effendi using his imagination. He was visualizing and predicting about the importance of the arts in teaching the faith. That day the cause will spread like wildfire when its spirit and teachings are presented on the stage or in art and literature. Art can better awaken such noble sentiments than cold rationalizing, especially among the mass of the people. This was also quoted in the Rizwan message of 153. Shoghi Effendi held high hopes for the arts as a means for attracting attention to the teachings. Here are a few quotes about imagination from non-Baha'i sources. Albert Einstein said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world." He also said, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. I kind of like that one. I like this one too, by Francis Bacon. Imagination was given to man to compensate him for what he is not. A sense of humor to console him for what he is. I'm going to post some other ones on the screen here so you can read these quotes, but you can also just Google it. There are many quotes about imagination. Okay, so in this section, I basically introduced the 5 spiritual powers. We talked a lot about imagination. In the next section, I'm going to spend some time talking about thought and comprehension and intelligence and how intelligence connects all these things together. And I also want to bring in how the arts are connected to all this whole concept between the physical and the spiritual powers.
Immerse yourselves in the ocean of my words, that ye may unravel its secrets and discover